So here's a new project, working on a friend's Honda Metropolitan. So what he's having is a problem with the carburetor. Can't seem to keep the bike running. The reason we know it's the carburetor is because he's actually had a little work done on it before. He's had some issues with the air filter and whatnot. So we're going to go through and we're going to pull it out and clean it up, put it back in, see if we can get it back running. If we have to, or if we find anything along the way, such as springs, seals, anything like that that's messed up, of course we'll be replacing those. The first thing you got to do on one of these is remove the seat, which I've actually already done that. It's just a simple process of releasing the seat, opening it up, and there's two bolts on the top where you see those two openings there, and there's one you can see there, but the other one's covered up by that white plastic. You take those four bolts out and you remove that yellow lever there. It goes in that larger hole you'll see right there above the big opening, and that allows the seat to be simply lifted off. So this is the bike after the seat's been removed, and we're ready to get down there to the carburetor. So way down in the hole here, you can see we've got a connector here we're going to have to take loose, and a connector here we're going to have to take loose, and then fuel line here, and the throttle control cable here, and then a union between the engine and the carburetor. And of course this is the air filter coming in on the other side of the carburetor. We'll take that loose as well. So here's the air intake. It's on the left side of the bike. Went in and took the air filter off. As you can see, there was 5 screws to get this plastic cover off the outer cover. So now I'm fixing to take the air box itself completely off. That way I can get it off of the carburetor boot. It's going to be a bolt here and a bolt here, and you should be able to slide it off after you get the boot loose from the carburetor. Okay, now that we've got that loose, like I said, we took the air box loose. Didn't come all the way out with those 2 bolts. There was a few more bolts that hold it on place because it mounts on with the that's the actual mud flap for the rear tires, so that mounts on as part of that air box. But it got it loose enough just by taking those 2 bolts loose to kind of get it out of the way so I could get the carburetor loose. So there's your intake side. That's the rubber boot going back to the air box. And I pointed out a tube on top. That was a ventilation tube, not a fuel feed. Our fuel lines are actually down here. On the right side of the carburetor, you've got 2 fuel lines here. You've got your intake with the filter on it, and this should be just a bleed off, so if it gets flooded, it's got somewhere to go. And then we've also got a hose on this other side, which is also appears to be some sort of bleed off, maybe a return. Not positive, don't know this real engine real well, but just want to make note of where those are, and we're going to take those loose with a couple of spring release clamps, and we'll have this carburetor out. So here we go, carburetor's out. Like I said, there's your 2 posts that you hook your fuel lines in on the right side of the bike, and here's your other one on the left hand side of the bike. So as you can see, there's the throttle body, the good old butterfly that moves when you move the throttle. Actually moves pretty good, so I don't think we got any issues there. So I think it's more of a needs a good cleaning and possibly some seals replaced. Quick note for you on something like this, whether it's a car or motorcycle, it doesn't matter what it is. If you take your intake off, carburetor, whatever it may be sure and put some sort of towel or something over or kind of down in the port, but not able to actually fall all the way down in the port, so that you don't get anything down in the intake. You know, if you're working around other stuff, you know, particularly cars with intakes on top, a lot of times your runners are pointing straight up. So if you're working on something else and you happen to drop a bolt or something like that, it can sure be real fun fishing it out if you do have something fall down in there. So This kind of falls in line with the spark plugs as well. You start pulling spark plugs out of the car, you might want to cover those up if you're going to have them out very long. If you're doing a quick swap one-to-one, not as big a deal, of course. But if it's going to be off for a little bit and you're doing some other stuff, cover your holes. That way you don't have to worry about trying to fish something out or possibly even having to take your engine down even further because you can't get it out. So this whole process to get the carburetor out pretty much was a 11mm socket, of course on a ratchet, a Phillips head screwdriver, a stubby Phillips head screwdriver, and a pry bar to pop the grommets off the intake and the carburetor. Here we have the carburetor apart. So we've got the bowl side taken apart, as well as both of the jets that go in that side. Here's the actual bowls that float up and down, and there's a needle that sets on it to cut off the fuel flow. All that looks pretty good except for this jet here. Looks like can't get anything going through, so we're not seeing any light through there. You should see at least some sort of light passage when you turn it up towards the light. We're not seeing anything, so that's probably where our issue lies. This one here, we can actually see through it. Everything looks good. Actually, you can kind of see through right there. I don't know how well. There we go. You can actually see through that one. So we're not getting any light going through this one, so we're pretty sure that's where it lies. But we are going to go ahead and put this in a vat, let it soak. We've got a sonic vat that we're going to set it in, so we don't have to worry about the plastic on this butterfly assembly because the sonic isn't corrosive to plastic. Should do us just fine. But we'll get that in there. We'll get those brass fittings in. Also, we had this needle set up. It's on a little solenoid of some sort. Not real familiar with these, so I apologize I can't be real detailed. But it did have quite a bit of oily substance inside of it, almost like motor oil. So we went and cleaned that up, got it to where it's moving freely, no binding. So we think that may be a possible problem as well, because though it was kind of gooey and slimy inside. You've also got this here, that's your throttle body sensor. So that there, you have to be sure that you take it off and put it right back on exactly right, because if you don't, the bike's computer will not understand where the throttle body's at, so it will once again cause running problems. So we got this out as well. You can see you got the flow going through there as well. Needle looks just fine. The diaphragm that goes around that, we inspected that and make sure it was all good. Didn't find any holes or cracks in it. So it doesn't look like we're really going to have to replace any seals or anything. Just simply try to clean it up and put it back together. So we got the carburetor out of the vat. It's been cleaned up pretty good. The jets we wound up having to file out a little bit on that smaller one right in the middle. Simply still had some stuff in it even after vatting. So that's probably why they weren't able to get the bike running after they worked on it. Whatever they did probably didn't get the gunk out of there either. We've got those two back in, tighten them back down with the flathead screwdriver. And we're going back in with the plunger. So you can see there it's got the needle that goes down through. So you have to make sure and line that needle up as you're putting the plunger back in. Do not force it. Just simply gently push it down. You can watch through this side, or if you hold the butterfly open you can look through the other side and see it. We've got that lined up, and then on top you have to roll this diaphragm over and get it into the groove here all the way around. And as you see, this diaphragm almost makes like a little star pattern when you get it in there all nice and neat. You don't want that twisted or bound up in any way. That is going to be moving as you drive the bike. So now we need to run our spring, our large spring. I'm going to run it down through the center. I'm going to line up our cap, the little nipple on the cap here. I have to line that center nipple up on the spring. Just like that. And then push it down to where it belongs. So there we go. There's only one way to put this little cap on, so you shouldn't be getting it mixed up. So we're going to run our two screws down on it. So we can check one more time before we tighten those down. Look in there, make sure the seal is all straight and lined up. and then push it down and tighten it up. So now we need to put our bowls and the needle back in place over here. That will shut off the fuel once this little bowl area fills up with fuel. So when you stop the bike, it doesn't just keep pouring fuel down into the engine. So we need to make sure we get this in here. See, it's in between there, and then there you can see the plastic. So when you do that, now that little pin will just hang. So now we can set that back down on our carburetor, back down here, and we're going to guide this bowl back down in that hole. So you got the pin going down the hole, and the bowls go down in the pits here on either side. So when it's done, it kind of sets like that. We still got one more piece. We've got the pin here, so we've got to slide that pin through. Doesn't matter which side, this flows straight through. You just have to make sure and line up your bowls with that pin. So once we get that lined up, it should just push right on in. It should not take very much force at all. There we go. So now the pin's in. See it there on that side. And then on that side, it pushes out very easily, so if you pick this up after you've put it in and start moving around, that may fall out, so be careful. So at this point, we've already put a little grease on here for the gasket and just help it seal up. Means that we are reusing the old gasket, they look just fine. So we're just going to pop this cover back on, and of course it only goes one way. There we are. So we got our holes lined up. Here's the cap back on. As we took it apart, the 3 screws. So got all those tightened back down. All we have left is the throttle position sensor and our regulator here. And those go on this side right here. So we're going to run our throttle sensor. Like I said, it has a black widow kind of shape on the inside. You're going to line that up with this tooth. It's going to be something about like that, and then you're going to turn it back to lock it in with the screw. Turn it back just a slight bit. And I said before, don't be playing with that. Once you take it loose, set it to the side. Do not move that around so you don't knock that sensor off. It should be in its rested state. And then when you put it in here, you're going to turn it, as you saw, just a tiny bit before you lock the screw in. That gets it to its 0 position. Now here's the port for our regulator. This is simply going to go down in here, and we have to be sure to be careful as we're putting that in as to line it up with its seat. If it binds too much on you, just back it off. Now keep in mind, it does have a spring inside, and this piece here moves as well as this piece here moves. There we go. Now I had to push pretty hard to hold that down. It's got a pretty tight spring inside there. Now I went ahead and put the cover back on as well. That just slides down on top of it once you have it screwed down. Just a Phillips head screw that holds that down. Just make sure it seals down just like that. And then the final piece before we put it back on the bike was the intake boot. So this boot hooks on to the engine here, and then of course on the carburetor on this opposite side. That thing is pretty tough to get on and off, especially on this bike. It's got, you know, some years on it, so that's gotten pretty firm. The rubber isn't quite as soft as it used to be, so popping that back on takes a little bit of pressure to get that back on. Simply tighten that up, get the clamp good and tight before we ever put it in the bike, so we don't have to worry about tightening up but this piece once it's on to the engine. So we'll get that back on here soon and see if we can get this thing running. Alright, so going back in with it, at this point we need to hook our hoses back up. So we got our hose here. Slide it on, all the way on, just like you see there. And then move our hose clamp we go, that hose is on. We'll put this one on and move our hose clamp for that one. Now we've got both those hose clamps on. Go ahead and put our connector on that one, and also on this other side. They only go one way, so you shouldn't be able to mismatch them. Now that one does have that black cover that makes it a little tougher to get on, so you kind of have to line it up to go over the other one and inside of the black cover. And we've got our air intake here. Go ahead and slide that on. And we also have to line up on this engine intake. That's going to be the hardest one to get on. We've got this rear hose that we've got to get on. Make sure you get that hose clamp past the little lump in the nipple. And we've also got this upper hose here we've got to get on. And be sure and get its hose clamp on. So now we just got to make sure we get this all the way onto our intake. You have to push on that pretty hard to get that in there. Just be careful not to crush or break any plastic or whatnot. We still got our throttle control here, so we've got to get that on as well. So that goes into the eyelet, and the cable goes down and around the loop, and then you can lift it back to get that guided in. And these nuts, be sure and not cross thread them. You want that to get tight to the point it's got just a little bit of room, and then you're going to tighten the other one down. So we'll get a wrench on those here in a second. So last but not least is the intake tube. Make sure we get that all the way on. There we go. Heard it pop right there. Means it went over that nipple on the end. She's in the right place. So looks like everything's in place. Just needs to be tightened down on a few of these screws and bolts, and then we'll be able to try to start the bike up before we put anything else on. When you're going back on with the air box, be sure and put this bolt here back on before you put the cover back on, because the bolt and its washer will not fit through this hole where you can actually see it. Now we got our filter in place, got our cover here. I'm gonna pop this back in place, and we'll see if we can get it to run. We have everything back in. Air box is on, air filter is on. Had a little trouble getting it started without having the throttle wide open, so that was a telltale sign that some stuff needed to be adjusted slightly. And sure enough, once we adjusted the throttle position here just a hair, had to move that down. That's the only real adjustment we have on this carburetor, because it's controlled by the electronic valve over here, and this, as I mentioned before, is just a throttle position sensor. So by opening this just not even a quarter of a turn, is probably only about an eighth, maybe even less than that, I was able to get it to stay running even after we let off the throttle. So go ahead and turn the bike on. Of course, make sure you got your battery connected. That's right here. That's the one we took loose when we started working on it initially. So that's all back on. And as I said, everything else is back on except for the seat. So we're going to do a kickstart. And there we go. There you can hear the idle settle down once it warmed up just a bit. And it's ready to go. One last note on the scooter. I did go for a ride after I adjusted it. And when I got back and got the bike up to normal operating temperature, I did have to go back in and adjust one more time. So I did leave the seat loose when I went and rode, so it kept me from having to undo all those bolts. And made it nice and quick just to lift the seat off, make my adjustments, and then ride it one more time just to make sure. But everything seems to be running just fine now. Looks like she'll be ready for a nice ride here soon. Save some gas for my friend.